and welcome to Creative Photo Folks channel. I'm Hayley and today I'll be showing you how to create a pop-up photo effect in Photoshop. Now for this technique, you really want to find a photo to work with that has a clearly identifiable subject, whether it be people, animals, or toys, something like that. It's best if your subject is included in full and not cropped out of any parts of the photo. And today I'm going to be showing you two examples, one created with a pet dog and one which is more of a storytelling image. This technique tends to work best when it's shot from a perspective that you can see a visible or have a sense of a visible horizon line in your image that isn't too high in the scene, because if your perspective is off, this technique isn't going to work as well. But you'll find that once you've tried it a few times, done a few experiments, you will be able to start to play more with the compositions you use and the shapes of the base. So let's begin. This is my friend's dog, Finch. While my dog hates the camera, Finch was the biggest poser I've ever met. So that's why I have chosen him for this image. Now this image is a little rough. I didn't take a whole lot of time. I just wanted to see what I could do with this effect. And so as we go through it today, hopefully we will create something that's a bit more polished. But let's begin. So first of all, I'm just going to move my subject onto a new document. And so here we are. This is the original image, and I have just done a tiny bit of cloning around his eyes and ears just to get rid of any of those little white spots that were a bit distracting. And I've just moved him over slightly in the composition to get the composition that I liked. So I'm just going to merge these layers so that the cloning is tied to the subject for life. And the first thing we'll do is make a copy of our base layer with Control or Command J. So you'll see now we have a copy over here in our layers panel. And just to make things less confusing, I'm going to call it base. And so I'm just double clicking to rename them and pop up. So firstly, we are going to select the base layer and make a rectangular selection. So to do that, we go to our marquee tool, which is the second one down on the toolbar on the left here, maybe somewhere else on your screen, depending on how you've got Photoshop set up. And I will choose, by holding this down, I will bring up some options and I'm going to choose rectangular marquee tool. And then I'm going to draw, I think it was about there. And this doesn't need to be perfect. We can change it later. Next, I'm going to right click inside here and choose transform selection, which will bring up some little bounding boxes that we can move around. And then I'm going to right click one more time and choose perspective. Now with this, we can drag in some corners individually. So I'm going to drag in the back a little bit and drag at the front a little bit, just to give it more of the correct perspective for the photo that we'll be creating. And then I'm going to right click again and choose scale. I'm going to hold down shift because if I don't, it scales the whole thing. So by holding down shift, I can just pull the back in and I can pull that down to a place where I kind of want the back of the photo to sit. Now, this does not have to be exact. We can manipulate it later, but this is just to give it a kind of guide, and then you can hit your little tick. And now we're going to add a layer mask to this layer with the add layer mask button, which is down at the bottom right here, and it's the little hole inside a rectangle. Let's just switch that off so we can see what that has done. Now I just want to add the white stroke to create the kind of photo effect. So to do that, we double click on the base layer, you'll see your bottom layer, and that will bring up your layer styles. And in here, we want to go to stroke. So you need to click on the word, which will also tick it. And you'll see that this has popped in a white box, but that may not have happened for you. So what we need to choose here is a size that's sort of about there. So that's 43 for me, might be slightly different for you. We want the position to be on the inside. The blend mode can be normal, and we want full opacity. And the color needs to be white, which is your very top left. So to access that, you just click it, drag your cursor to the top left and hit OK. And that should be good enough. So hit OK again. Now we are going to turn on our other layer, so our pop-up layer, and we're going to make a selection of the subject. So there's a couple of ways to do this as Photoshop stands at the moment. So the first one I'm going to try is the object selection tool. This is the fourth one down on your toolbar. And if you hold that down with your mouse key, you can choose Object Selection Tool, which is the top one. And what this will try to do is make a selection of any subjects it finds in the image. So that is looking almost good. It's just gotten a bit in here that I probably wouldn't want. But I'm quite happy with that. So I'm just going to hit once with my mouse and it will now have a little think for a bit and eventually make a selection. So not bad, but it's missing the back of him, the stick, and his front paw. So I'm just going to get rid of that with Control or Command D and try another way with Select and then Subject. So that has done slightly better, but still not quite. So the front of the subject doesn't really matter because we've got it on this base layer, but you do want to make sure that the top is pretty good. So to fix that, I'm going to go back to my object selection tool, which I'm still already in. What I will do is hold down my Shift key and I'm going to draw a little bit of a rectangle around the bits that it's missed. And that tells Photoshop to take a second look. So, no, don't like that. I'm going to undo it and do that another way. Let's try this section here. Now, the reason it's struggling is because these areas are so blurry. So no, let's try the paw. Actually, we don't really need to worry about the paw, so I might not. But I did want this stick in, so I will just kind of see how it goes with the stick. And I really, really only need the tip of that stick, which it's got, so almost. So I'm just going to tidy this up manually now using my lasso tool, which is the third one down on the toolbar. And I'm going to hold down Shift and just drag around the areas that I want included. Again, don't worry too much about these bottom bits, but at the moment it's hard to tell what will and won't be included. And it's got a little bit too much of the stick, so I will just hold down Alt or Option to say, now I don't want this bit, and drag around those areas. If you are having a go with this tool and struggling, as in carefully drawing around edges, that comes with practice. The lasso tool you will not be good at drawing with right away unless you are an illustrator. Cool, so I think that is good enough. And then we're going to add another layer mask to this pop-up layer this time. There we go. And look, it's almost done, but not quite. Next, I'm going to give Finchy a new background. So let's do that with a gradient map. And we do that by going to our little half pie icon here, which is our adjustment layers, and choosing gradient. Now I'm just going to hit OK on that and then drag it to the bottom so I can see what I'm doing. And then I will double click it again to bring it back. And to play with my gradient, I just click on this bar here. And we've got all these little presets we can choose from. So in this case, I could choose a green. They're pretty ick greens though, to be honest. But you can see what that is doing. I'm going to manually choose my greens. And to do that, I can double click these little stops at the bottom. And then automatically this will bring up an eyedropper if I kind of bring it over the top of the image. So I want to choose like a green from the grass. And I want it to be a little on the darker side. Yeah, maybe that one. Hit OK. And then to choose my highlight color, I can double click this one. And again, I could choose something from the image. Maybe something like that. And hit OK again. And I can have that linear as it is at the moment, so it's gradually getting darker, or I could try. Now the reason why that's not working is because this gradient editor is still open, so we'll just hit OK to get out of it too. And then I could try radial, and I like that, but let's reverse it, and then I can scale it so that there's a little bit more of that lightness. So do I like that better than that? Yeah, I think I do. So yeah, pretty happy with that. So yeah, with my scaling, I just dragged my arrow across to make it bigger or smaller. And now I'll hit OK. Next, I am going to reselect this flat layer. So I'm going to see the little layer mask next to it. I'm going to press Control or Command and click that. Now that reloads our selection. And what I'm going to do is add a new layer. So new layer is this little plus inside a box. And I'm going to go up to Edit, Fill. And I'm going to make sure that the contents are black and hit OK. And you won't see that at the moment, so I'm just going to press Control or Command D to get rid of that selection now. But you can see this layer here is now filled with black. And if I load my Move tool with V, so it's the top one on your toolbar, we can actually pull that down and you'll see now that there is a shadow. I'm going to undo it and leave it where it is for now. We'll come back to that shortly. Now I want to make my photo a little bit curly. So with our base layer, there is a little link between the picture and the layer mask. I'm going to click that link and turn it off. And that means we can now adjust the image but leave the layer mask alone. And also we can now affect the layer mask and leave the image alone. So that's what we want to do. So make sure that your layer mask is highlighted as it is here. Then we're going to go to Control or Command T, which brings up our transform commands. And now if I right click inside, I can go to Warp. Now what we want to do with Warp is pull the back down a little bit so it's curly. Although maybe not quite that curly. We can pull up these edges at the front. So it looks like the photo has just curled a little bit. We didn't want to do this quite subtly. Nothing too big here. That's probably okay. And then I will hit my plus. But you can see now that shadow we created has become a little bit of an issue. So let's do some work there. First of all, we do not want to see it at the back. So I will add a layer mask to that layer, making sure it's highlighted. I will click my layer mask button. Then I will load my brush tool with B, or it's this one here on the toolbar, making sure that black is selected as my swatch, and I can change them with that little arrow there. Now I just want to paint it away from anywhere it shouldn't be, which is essentially the sides or the back. Now that shadow is too harsh, so I'm going to make sure that layer is selected. I'm going to press Control or Command T to bring up our transform tools again, and we will again go to right click and then warp. Now here I'm going to bring down the bottom a little bit, bring up that bit a little bit, and we want the perspective of the shadow to be the same as the image. So I will just pull in the edges so that's the case. So you can see how they are now parallel. And then I'll press my tick to lock that in. So that's looking a little better, although it is still way too harsh. So the next thing we're going to do is give it a little bit of a blur. And we want that blur to be more pronounced on the edges rather than in the middle, because that's how shadows work. This is further away, so therefore it would be more blurry. So we'll go to Filter, Blur Gallery, and then Tilt Shift. Now we're going to drag this little point down to the point of where the middle of our shadow is. And I'm going to now spin this by putting my cursor near this little point here, and you'll see it changes to like a rotational arrow, and then we can spin it so it's straight up and down. And now we will bring up the blur on the sides here. So not quite that much, but a little more than that. Yeah, I think that's looking good. Forget this bit at the back. We'll mask that out in a second, and then we'll hit OK. So you'll see how harsh that is and how in a second that will change to something a bit more realistic. Beautiful. So with my layer mask highlighted, my brush tool loaded, and black, we'll just paint that extra bit away. And now the other thing that would happen is that it would be darker in the middle and then more faded out at the edges. So we'll do that now. So making sure that the shadow layer is selected, we're going to press Control or Command G, which creates a group, and it puts that layer in a group by itself. And then with that group highlighted, we can add another layer mask to it. So this layer mask will not affect the one we created earlier, which was masking out the excess shadow. And now we need to taper out the edges of the shadow. So to do that, we are going to load the gradient tool with G, and it's this one here on your toolbar. And then we want to make sure that linear is selected here on the left. And then, sorry, this is a little bit more advanced, but that's cool. I will guide you along. So then by clicking the little gradient bar here, it brings up this dialog box. Yours may look slightly different. If that's the case, you can go to here and click Append Default Gradients. But otherwise, you want to go into this basics box here and choose the middle one. So we want it to be tapering from black to transparent. If you do not have black loaded here, you can double click this bottom bar here and make sure that your blacks are selected over here on the bottom right. Hit OK and OK. Now, we will put our gradient or our little crosshair about where the shadow starts, and it doesn't have to be in the image. And we're going to drag across so that we can taper out those edges. You can experiment a few times just by redrawing. And I think that looks quite good. So before and after certainly makes it more realistic. And then one last thing, I just think this edge here is still a bit harsh. So I'm going to highlight that shadow layer and then go to Filter, Blur, Gaussian Blur. And I think that's already done a pretty good job. It's at about 25%. And yeah, that definitely looks softer. So that was before and after. I might actually just bring it down a little bit. It will be a bit harsher because it's closer to the edge. And then okay. And that is pretty much it. So you could now play at this stage with, I think it's a little bit too bent. So I could go back to the layer mask for that, press Ctrl or Command T, right click, hit warp, and then bring those down a bit if I wanted. So it's not quite so severe. But one particular issue that this image has, which hopefully you will not, is that if we zoom in, see how the subject is really blurry, but the photo isn't. And for me, that is a problem. So what I would need to do is blur the edges of the back of the photo so the depth matches. And that means blurring this base layer. So now I'm going to do it in a bit of an advanced step. And you probably won't have this problem if your subject has quite good depth. But if it doesn't, let me show you the way to fix it. What I'm going to do is switch off this pop-up layer. So we've lost the top half of our subject. And then I'm going to highlight the base layer here and make it a stamp visible layer. So to do that, I have to hold down Shift, Control or Command, Alt or Option, and then hit E. And what that does is makes a layer where it's basically taken every layer here and smushed it into one. So now it's all on its own layer. Now I can go to Filter, Blur, Gaussian Blur, and we want to make it blurry enough so it matches the subject. So what I might actually do is just flick that subject back on so we can see what we're doing. And then again, go to Filter, Blur, Gaussian Blur. And I want to try and get the back blurry enough so that it matches how blurry the subject is. So perhaps there, and hit OK. However, it's now blurred the front of the image, which we don't want. And so now what I'm doing is saying to Photoshop, I only want the back half of this blur, not the front half. So we do that obviously with a layer mask. And we're going to use a gradient like we did before, so it's really subtle. So we'll load that gradient tool with G, making sure that we've still got kind of a black to clear. And then from the bottom, I'm going to draw upwards so that this part is now no longer blurry, but the back is. If you drew upwards and you got the opposite effect, you will just need to tick this little reverse box up here. So I think that looks better. What do you guys think? So if I were to play with this a little bit more, I would probably make the back a little bit lower and the front a little bit higher, just to make it kind of more of a flat plane. At the moment, it's sort of floating. But that's something we could also play with our gradient fill that we were working with earlier. I could change it back to linear and swap that around and scale it back down just to make this base look a bit more flat. But these are all things you can play with to taste. So that is my image here. Now let me just show you another that I've worked on. So this is another image I created, and this is using stock images because I couldn't find the images I wanted in my own catalog. But I love to tell stories about nature and the effects that humanity is having on the planet. So I love to make these little commentaries, and I liked this effect to make this particular commentary, which is, you know, now we have this barren earth, whereas once this used to be kind of a lush forest. So I basically used the exact same technique. The tree was a little hard to cut out, and actually it's still quite rough. I would still do quite a bit more work to this. But you can just see how this effect can be used for more storytelling images if you just really think about what it is you want to try and convey. So juxtaposing two scenes can be really, really cool with this effect to make some kind of social commentary. In this case, I've juxtaposed the barren, cracked earth with the lush tree and grass. But with a bit of thought, I'm sure you can come up with other interesting ways to juxtapose two different subjects. And this With a little more work, it could make a great stock image. If I had my own stock, it could make an interesting print. So just some things to think about when working with this technique. It doesn't all have to be cutesy portraits. It can actually be quite compelling and powerful. So I'd love to see what you come up with. I'm really excited to see the results from this one. So if you pop on over to Creative Photo Folks Facebook page and just show us what you created, that would be really appreciated. Thanks so much for joining me today. If you enjoyed this video, please help me out by giving it a like. And if you'd like to see more, then tap that subscribe button. As always, happy creating!